My mom called me ugly at my graduation. I left with just $355 and never looked back. 12 years later. My name is Delilah Marsh, and I was 18 when my mother stood up at my high school graduation dinner, tapped her wine glass, and told 40 relatives that God gave my sister the face and gave me the consolation prize of a brain. People laughed. My father studied his napkin. I smiled, said nothing, and started planning my exit before the dessert plates were cleared. Have you ever smiled through a room laughing at you, while quietly deciding you would never let them see you flinch again? If stories about quiet revenge and family betrayal keep you up scrolling at 1 a.m. like they do me, hit subscribe now. You don't want to miss where this one ends up 12 years later.
I'm Delilah.
Everyone calls me D. I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, the older daughter in a family that ran an event rental company. Tents, chairs, linens, everything you'd need to throw a wedding you couldn't quite afford on your own. This is the story of how I left with $355, and what happened the night my family tried to use my name to pay for one. Our family's business was called Marsh Event Rentals. We supplied tents, folding chairs, chafing dishes, and string lights to half the weddings and graduation parties in our county. My mother, Carol Marsh, ran the front office and treated the showroom like her personal stage. My father, Gene Marsh, kept the books and rarely said more than he had to. My younger sister, Renee, was 2 years behind me in school, and from the time I can remember, she was the daughter my mother introduced first. The pattern started small. When Renee turned 16, my parents bought her a used Honda Civic with a bow on the hood, photographed for the family newsletter my mother printed every December. When I turned 16 2 years earlier, I was handed a bus pass and told that walking built character. When Renee made the junior varsity dance team, my mother rented a banner for the shop window. When I made the honor roll 3 semesters running, she mentioned it once in passing to a customer who happened to ask. The comparisons weren't always loud. Most arrived in small, deniable pieces. At Sunday dinners, my mother asked Renee about boys and parties, then turned to me and asked whether I'd finished my chores. When relatives visited, Renee got the good seat near the window. I got the folding chair from inventory, still smelling faintly of the warehouse. My father noticed. I know he did because sometimes late at night, he'd leave a granola bar on my dresser without a word. The closest thing to an apology he ever offered. But he never corrected my mother in front of anyone. When I once asked why Renee got a car and I didn't, he said, "Your mother has her reasons," and went back to his ledger. He kept the peace by refusing to notice the war. By 17, I had built an entire belief system just to survive dinner. I told myself the imbalance was temporary, that once I graduated, once I proved myself, things would even out. What I couldn't tell myself was that any of it was random. My mother ran that business the way she ran her daughters, by deciding in advance who was worth investing in. Renee had tuition set aside since birth. I was told at 15 I'd need to figure out financial aid, because the business couldn't stretch that far for both of us. Renee got new dresses for every event. I got Renee's dresses from 2 years earlier, taken in at the waist. I kept a mental ledger of my own, the kind no one else could see. Not out of bitterness, or that's what I told myself, but because somewhere underneath the coping, I already suspected I'd need proof one day. I just didn't know proof of what yet. My graduation dinner was held in our own showroom, because my mother said renting a hall for just family was wasteful. She was wrong about the just family part. She'd invited 41 people, aunts, uncles, my father's business partners, 3 of Renee's friends, and a woman from the local paper covering hometown milestones. The showroom was strung with the same white lights we rented out every June. Arranged around folding tables draped in the same ivory linens we charged brides $400 a set to use. I remember the smell of the caterers chafing dishes, and the hum of the box fans my father ran to keep the warehouse cool. I remember wearing a dress Renee had worn to her own middle school formal, taken in at the waist by my aunt. My mother stood up during dessert, tapped a fork against her glass, and asked for everyone's attention. She thanked the guests, thanked the caterer, thanked God. Then she turned to me and said, loud enough for the back tables to hear, "Delilah worked so hard for that scholarship." Good thing, too. God gave her sister the face in this family, and gave Delilah the consolation prize of a brain. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My Aunt Sherry laughed loudest, the same aunt who'd hemmed the dress I was wearing. My mother pulled Renee up beside her, straightened the strap of Renee's dress, and added, "This one's going to marry well. This one's going to have to work for everything, but she'll manage." My father studied the tablecloth. Two of Renee's friends had their phones out, filming what they thought was a sweet toast. "I want to tell you I said something sharp and unforgettable." I didn't. I smiled the smile I'd practiced for years, thanked her for the toast, and asked if anyone wanted more cake. Have you ever had to serve dessert to a room that just laughed at you? I left an hour later, before the last folding chairs were stacked. I went to the small filing cabinet in the office that held my babysitting and summer job earnings, $355, counted twice. I left my house key on my mother's desk, next to the graduation card she'd signed with just her name, no message inside. I didn't slam a door. I called a cab from the gas station down the road and asked the driver to take me to the Greyhound station in Dayton. The last bus that night was headed to Fort Wayne, Indiana. I picked it because it was the farthest ticket I could afford, $61, and because I didn't know a single person there who could call my mother and report where I'd gone. I sat by the window with $294 folded into my sock and watched Millbrook disappear behind a gas station sign. By the following week, my mother had already told the extended family I was going through something and would come to her senses. Nobody called to check if I was safe. I wasn't dramatic. I was gone. In my family, those got treated as the same thing. Fort Wayne didn't care that I'd been the family joke. It didn't know I existed at all, and for the first time in my life, that felt like relief instead of erasure. I spent my first 2 nights in the bus station, then in a 24-hour laundromat on Clinton Street, pretending to wait on clothes that weren't mine. On the 3rd day, I found an index card taped to the window of a record storage company called Redline Archive Services, hiring for the overnight shift, pulling files, scanning old bank and insurance records, keeping the warehouse organized. I told the manager, a tired man named Franco Duya, that I had experience. My only real qualification was that I needed the job more than anyone else who'd applied. He hired me anyway because nobody wanted the overnight shift. I rented a room from a nursing student named Priya Anand, whose previous roommate had left owing 3 months' rent. Priya didn't comfort me or ask many questions. She gave me a week to produce my share of the deposit and told me not to touch the labeled leftovers in the fridge. Her bluntness was strangely the first honest thing anyone had offered me in months. On my 9th night there, my mother tracked down my new number and called while I was in the shower. Priya answered. I walked out just in time to hear my mother say, "Tell Delilah that running away doesn't erase what she looks like." Priya put the phone on speaker and asked evenly, "Is this a bad night for you? Or are you always like this?" My mother called me unstable and ungrateful before Priya hung up. I stood in the kitchen shaking, not because I believed a word of it, but because I finally heard out loud how easily my mother rewrote me for an audience. Priya got out a notebook that night and told me to write down the date, the number, exactly what had been said. People who lie that confidently, she said, are counting on nobody keeping records. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence would end up shaping the rest of my life. I started keeping everything after that. Voicemails, texts, 2 letters my mother eventually mailed. One demanding an apology, one falsely claiming my father was seriously ill. I never answered either. During the day I enrolled in a community college program in financial records and fraud examination, paid in installments covered by warehouse pay. At night, surrounded by other people's old contracts and signatures, I discovered a strange, specific talent. I could see when a document was lying. By 23, I'd finished a forensic document examiner certification and taken a job at an insurance investigation firm in Indianapolis, tracing forged claims and stolen identities for a living. The work gave me something my childhood never had. Facts that didn't change depending on who was loudest in the room. I met Theo Bianchi, a civil engineer, at a friend's dinner, and married him in a courthouse 3 years later, with Priya as my only witness from home. My family and I stayed almost entirely apart for the better part of a decade. My father sent birthday cards with no return address. Renee sent, then deleted social media requests. My mother, according to relatives, told anyone who asked that I'd left out of jealousy and shame over the family business. Then 9 years after I left, a case landed on my desk that I almost didn't recognize. Our firm had been retained to review a disputed credit line connected to a struggling event rental company in Ohio, one that had recently expanded after claiming storm damage to its warehouse. The company had been renamed twice through a holding entity, so nothing registered at first. Then I saw the address. Our old warehouse. My mother's business. I flagged the conflict immediately and requested reassignment. But before the file left my hands, I saw one document that stopped me completely. A personal guarantee form bearing my full legal name, Delilah and Marsh, with a signature built to resemble mine. Close enough to pass a glance, wrong enough that I, of all people, could see exactly where it had been traced. The form listed me as a part owner who'd authorized company debt, using my personal credit as collateral. I had never signed anything. I had never owned a share of that company. The date on the form was 6 years after I'd left home with $355 in my sock. Before I tell you what I found when I pulled my full credit file, and what my mother had actually built using my name, subscribe now because the next part is the reason this story exists. Because of the conflict, I couldn't work the case professionally. But nothing stopped me from protecting myself as a private citizen. I requested my full credit history that week and sat at my kitchen table with Theo while 11 years of paperwork printed out, page after page. What I found went far beyond one guarantee form. 2 years after I left, my mother had opened a retail credit account in my name, paid it faithfully enough to avoid detection, and used that clean history to co-sign equipment leases and supplier agreements for the business. Most of those accounts had since closed. One had not. It secured a business line of credit, recently increased to $410,000. Theo asked if I was going to call her. I said not yet. Calling would only give her time to shred files and build a new story, the way she always had. Instead, I filed an identity theft report, froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, hired an attorney in Ohio, and formally notified the lender's fraud department in writing with dates, documents, and a request to preserve every record connected to that account. For the first time in my life, I didn't respond to my family as the difficult daughter defending herself. I responded as an examiner preserving evidence, because that's what I had become. 3 weeks later, Renee called. I hadn't heard her voice in nearly a decade. She said our mother was under a lot of stress, and asked if I would sign a short statement confirming I'd verbally approved the old accounts years ago. Just paperwork, she called it. To clean things up. When I said no, her voice hardened. You already left us once. Are you really going to ruin Mom over a signature? I asked whose idea it had been to use my name in the first place. She went quiet for a long moment before saying, You weren't using your credit for anything anyway. That sentence told me everything. My family hadn't just cut me out. They'd kept a spare version of me around, ready to use whenever it was convenient. Before we hung up, Renee mentioned, almost in passing, that she was engaged to a bank loan officer named Mark Sutton, and their wedding would take place that spring at a restored train depot outside Millbrook, fully paid for, she said, by our mother, finally doing something nice. When I reviewed the active credit line again that night, I found 3 large transfers to an event coordination company connected to that exact depot. The wedding wasn't a gift from my mother. It was financed with debt secured by my stolen identity. I sent everything to my attorney and said nothing publicly. I didn't need to invent a consequence. I only needed to stop shielding my family from the one they'd already created. The invitation arrived at my office 3 months before the wedding. Cream cardstock, my name handwritten. No personal note inside. It described the day as a celebration of family, loyalty, and new beginnings. Priya thought they wanted me there to perform a reconciled family before the fraud case became public. Theo thought it was more practical. If I showed up and said nothing, my mother could later claim my presence meant I'd accepted the old arrangements. My attorney agreed I could attend, as long as I made no public statements and carried copies of my identity theft report. I told them I'd go alone. I wore a navy dress and the plain gold watch Priya had given me the day I passed my certification exam. The depot stood less than 15 miles from the house I grew up in, but it felt like a different country. Restored brick walls, string lights nicer than anything our old showroom ever rented out, a string quartet warming up near the entrance. My mother spotted me at the guest book table and produced her practiced smile for the relatives standing near her. Delilah, she said, loud enough to carry. Look who finally remembered she has a family. A few people laughed uncertainly. 12 years earlier, that sound would have sent me straight back out the door. This time I held her eyes and said, I remember exactly what kind of family I have. My father hugged me without asking, thinner and grayer than I remembered, and whispered that he was sorry. Sorry for what? I asked. He looked toward my mother and said only, for how everything happened, which told me he still couldn't name what he'd allowed. Renee found me near the bridal suite, veil pinned, surrounded by bridesmaids. She pulled me into a stiff hug for a hovering photographer and murmured, Let's not make today about old drama. I said, then don't finance it with my name. Her grip tightened for a second before she caught herself and let go. My mother introduced me to guests as her complicated daughter, told one couple I'd left home because I couldn't handle discipline. I let most of it pass until she pulled out an old, unflattering yearbook photo of me to make a point about vanity. I finally asked evenly, Have you shown them the loan documents too? Her face changed instantly. She steered me into a small side office and shut the door, my father trailing behind, Renee hovering just outside, pretending not to listen. Inside, my mother insisted the accounts were administrative shortcuts. Not fraud. Parents handle paperwork for their kids all the time, she said. I reminded her I'd been a legal adult, living in another state, and had authorized nothing. My father admitted, quietly, that the business had nearly failed and my mother had used my name first because my credit was clean. He'd objected, he said, then signed the resolution supporting the loans anyway. His confession sounded more embarrassed than sorry. My mother pulled a folded statement from her clutch, claiming I had verbally approved every account and had recently misremembered things due to emotional distress. She offered me $40,000, once the refinancing cleared, if I signed it that morning. I recognized the formatting. It matched the lender's file exactly. She'd planned this before I ever walked in. You invited me here to turn fraud into consent, I said. She told me not to use dramatic words. When she reached for my folder, I caught it before she could pull it free. Renee slipped in and locked the door behind her. Just sign it, she said. Mom already paid deposits we can't get back. I asked whether Mark knew where the wedding money had actually come from. She looked at the floor. That was answer enough. Mark was waiting in the hallway when I opened the door. He'd caught only the last few words, but something in his face had already shifted. As a loan officer, he recognized the shape of what he was looking at before I said a single word. 10 minutes before the ceremony, Mark asked the coordinator to hold the music. He stood at the front of the aisle and asked Renee, in front of the gathered guests, why my name was the guarantor on the loan that had paid for their wedding, and why she'd hidden it from him after I'd already reported the signature as forged. The question landed harder than any shout could have. Renee's bouquet dropped an inch. Somewhere in the second row, a guest whispered the word forged, and it moved through the room like weather. My mother reached for the microphone. Mark simply moved it out of her reach, then told the room quietly that the wedding would not be happening that day. The lender's fraud division arrived that same week, not with handcuffs in a ballroom, but with formal notices, device holds, and instructions that no records be altered. I was grateful it wasn't a spectacle. I wanted accountability, not a show. My mother had built her entire life around shows. Over the following year, the investigation confirmed what the documents already suggested. My mother had used my identity, and briefly Renee's too, to secure equipment leases and credit going back nearly a decade. She eventually cooperated, sold most of the company's remaining assets toward restitution, and accepted a plea agreement that included probation and years of financial monitoring. The Marsh Event Rentals sign came down that winter and was never replaced. My father avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully, but lost the business, most of his savings, and the trust of employees who'd worked for the family for years. He began writing me monthly letters full of explanations about keeping the peace, hoping my mother would fix things quietly. I returned the first 3 unopened. In the 4th, he finally wrote one honest sentence. I protected myself from conflict by letting you carry it instead. I answered once and told him forgiveness wasn't a door he could knock on until I was ready, and that it would take him living differently, not just apologizing to get there. Renee spent months untangling vendor disputes from the canceled wedding. Mark ended the engagement for good. She eventually moved 2 hours away, took a job at a community nonprofit, and started seeing a counselor. Almost 2 years after that morning at the depot, she called me without asking for anything. No signature, no money, no forgiveness. She apologized for helping erase me, and admitted that being the favored daughter had never made her safe. It had only made her useful, right up until the moment she wasn't. I told her an apology was a start, not proof. Since then we've built something small and careful. A few honest calls a year, no pretending 12 years didn't happen, no dramatic reunions. Just the slow work of finding out whether trust can grow somewhere entitlement used to live. Theo and I have been married for 6 years now. When the courthouse clerk asked if I wanted to change my name, I said no. Delilah Marsh was the name my mother had once decided belonged to her, to use however she needed. Keeping it became my answer to that, proof that something doesn't stop being yours just because someone else misuses it. I run my own consulting practice now, helping small lenders and family-owned businesses catch internal fraud before it becomes culture instead of an accident. I also fund a small emergency grant at the community college that once let me enroll in installments, $355, given to students facing a sudden housing or transportation crisis. It isn't a fortune, but I know exactly how far it can carry someone when it's paired with one honest opportunity. People sometimes ask if exposing my family was revenge. I understand why they ask. A wedding stopped. A business closed. My mother lost the authority she'd spent decades protecting. But revenge would have meant creating pain for the pleasure of watching them feel it. I didn't create their consequences. I only stopped shielding them from the ones they'd already built, and let the people affected by their choices decide what to do with the truth. Boundaries were never the punishment. They were simply the price of access to my life. And accountability isn't cruelty just because the person facing it happens to share your last name. For years, I believed leaving made me the daughter who broke our family. It took the investigation to show me I'd only stopped holding its cracks together with my own silence. My mother's greatest loss wasn't the business. It was losing the power to decide for everyone else what was true. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with Delilah's story. If it meant something to you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me in the comments, would you have signed that statement to keep the peace? Or walked away like she did? I read every comment, and I can't wait to hear what you would have done.